Well, it's a couple minutes past the hour, so perhaps we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Nasiarchin with the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and glad to have you all joining us this afternoon while we talk about Minnesota's Refugee Resettlement Consortium and
Can't hear you, Paul.
I'm sorry? Glad to have you all this afternoon. So we'll get started in just a moment. I'm going to turn it over to Cassie Bean, who is with us from the GHR Foundation. Cassie is a member of the Minnesota Council on Foundations who really put together a lot of this session. So as members of the Council on Foundations, if there is an interest that you have, a topic area that you'd like to share with other members, there's always an opportunity to bring together a member briefing. And so we're excited that Cassie was able to do that today for us, and I'll turn it over to Cassie. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon, this rainy afternoon. My name is Cassie Bean, and I am the program manager for the Twin Cities Racial Equity Initiative at GHR Foundation. But today I'm coming to you in my capacity as a board member at the International Institute of Minnesota to really discuss the important work of Minnesota Refugee Resettlement and the Consortium, and just discuss the state of affairs within this space. But first, I just want to talk about our format together before we dive in. And so I will do that now. We're going to open with a reading by Kao Kalia Yang from her book, Somewhere in the Unknown World. Following her reading, we will have a short presentation to provide context and really an overview of the refugee resettlement process. And finally, we will segue into a Q&A where hopefully you all will have a chance to ask questions to our expert panelists who I will introduce at that time. I know we're in a virtual reality. We're all moving from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. And so right now, I'd just like to invite you to take a breath and ground yourself for this conversation, which is going to be a very fruitful discussion. And so at that, I'd like to introduce Kao Kalia Yang. Ms. Yang is an award-winning Hmong American writer and the author of the memoir, The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir, and also the song poet. Yang is also the author for the children's book, A Map into the World, The Shared Room, and the Most Beautiful Thing. She co-edited the groundbreaking collection, What God is Honored Here, Writings on Miscarriage and Infant Loss by and for Indigenous Women and Women of Color. Her work has been recognized by the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Chautauqua Prize, the Penn USA Literary Awards, the Dayton's Literary Peace Prize, and garnered 3 Minnesota Book Awards. In November 2020, Ms. Yang's latest work, Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir, was released. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. I had the pleasure of finishing the book a few weeks ago, and it is really amazing. I think it's a must read. And so at that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Kao Kalia Yang, and have her share some select readings from her book. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cassie, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all of you for being here. I have many people to thank for this book, and many of them are in this room right now. The work of this book began with conversations with Ben, with Yusuf, with Michaela, and so many of you. And so I wanted to bring this book back now that it is done to the origins in so many ways of where the story began. In those conversations, I learned that while many of you have, you know what happens to refugees once we get here, but the story of how we get here is a story that many refugees are not willing or able, or not in a position to tell upon coming into this country. And that was part of the heart for this book. And so I'm going to take you through and do some brief readings from at least 3 different refugee narratives. This is a book of 14 different refugee narratives. While Minnesota is not high up for diversity, we have more refugees per capita here than any other state in the nation, as many of you know. Although we're hardly ever part of these national conversations, I think now is beyond the time. And so many reasons why this book belongs here, many reasons why it starts from here. Somewhere in the Unknown World came out in November of 2020. It began in 2016 when President Donald J. Trump was elected. For the refugees from everywhere, men, women, and children whose fates have been held by the interests of nations, whose rights have been contested and denied, whose thirst and hunger go unheeded and unseen. It begins with a poem by my favorite American poet, the great Lucille Clifton. Quilting. Somewhere in the unknown world, a yellow-eyed woman sits with her daughter quilting. Some otherwhere alchemists mumble over pots, their chemistry stirs into science, their science freezes into stone. In the unknown world, the woman threading together her need and her needle nods toward the smiling girl. Remember, this will keep us warm. How does this poem end? Do the daughters quilt? Do the alchemists practice their tables? Do the worlds continue spinning away from each other forever? We'll go first to Mayra's story. Mayra is from Bosnia. Her story is titled Up Close, It Is Different. I boarded the plane against the better judgment of my mother and father for Nyala, the capital of the state of South Darfur in southwest Sudan. Not knowing what to expect, I was 23 years old at the time. I had just started working for the American Refugee Committee. I was not the team's first choice to go on the trip, but everyone else's visa had been denied. I was a recent college graduate and my resume was clean. Mine was the only visa approved. My task was to see what the 100,000 people in a refugee camp in South Darfur needed in terms of humanitarian relief. At ARC, we're interested in 3 primary areas of camp life: water management, health, and nutrition. My family had lived in a war zone. To return to one was the last thing that my parents had wanted for me. I found myself in the middle of the Sahara Desert, wind and sun and sand bearing down on me. I was thin and 6 feet tall, so immediately I stood out. A white girl with pale skin, brown eyes, hair pulled back in a ponytail. I saw the people looking at me with wild eyes, bodies tense. The little children who clung to their mothers in the doorways of the camp tents looked upon me with uncertainty. I was swept with a sense of nostalgia so powerful and familiar, I reeled from the unintended blow. An older man, the cultural leader in the camp, was the first to formally greet me. I held my notebook and my pen in my hands and bowed my head respectfully as he addressed me. He held his head high. His eyes were the color of brown glass. His wrinkled lids drooped over the tops of his eyes. His voice was deep and windy and old. He said, "White girl, let me tell you." I listened quietly as he told me everything he wanted and needed. When he was done, I looked him in the eyes and said, slowly, "I too am Muslim. I, like the people in this camp, also come from a history of war and displacement." The old man listened to my words with grave interest. I could see a dawning understanding grow in his eyes. Then a smile emerged on his face, revealing a set of strong teeth that matched the set of his jaw. He said, "Yes, why else would a white girl who was comfortable in one country choose to go to a new country to learn of the discomforts of other people?" He added, "I understand your empathy and your connections to this place now. Even though we look different, every refugee feels for another." We became friends. He became the cultural translator for me in the month I stayed in the camp to assess the needs of its most vulnerable families. I talked to the women who would not look me in the eye, who pulled their garments to cover exposed arms and legs and sat curled tight into themselves. I asked them things that the men in positions similar to mine had never asked. Why do you feel unsafe at the camp hospital? In that first trip and all the trips that followed, I found in the different countries and people the memories of my life in war-torn Bosnia. I found versions of myself, my mother, and my father, and I got to ask them what they needed to do, what they needed, and to do the things that made their lives easier, better, possible. In every trip I've taken, I've affirmed a promise I made to myself. I want to be the kind of person that I had needed in our time of instability, in the worst years of the war. I'm going to read a little bit from Myra's selection. This is the day that they found out her father had joined the army. So Myra was 4 when the war started. She was 8 when the war ended. For those 4 years, Myra lived every day in an apartment without electricity, while her mother went to work, not because there was work to do, but because that was the only way to get the rations for the family, bread and powdered milk. On the day Papa joined the army, the sun was warm and bright in Zenica. Papa came home in his usual fashion. Once the greetings were done, he moved to a chair in front of the television. His long musician's hands clasped and unclasped beneath his chin. He looked into the dark screen of the television, studying his reflection. Mama was in the kitchen. I was at the table with my coloring books. In a careful voice, Papa called Mama and me to him. Mama picked me up at the dining table and held me in her lap on a chair by Papa's. Papa cleared his throat before he said, I have news. Today, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina came to my workplace to do a draft. I was not drafted, but our dear friend was. As you know, he is Catholic. As you know, the army is entirely Muslim. As you know, he would not survive the war in the army as a Catholic man. I turned my head up toward Mama. Her eyes were on Papa's face. She studied him, her brow furrowed. What? She asked. Papa cleared his throat. His large hands now capped his knees. He leaned toward Mama and me and said, I could not live with myself if I let my best friend die. I have volunteered to go in his place. Mama's body became stiff where moments before it had been soft. She said, you volunteered to join the army in order to save your dear friend? Papa nodded. She repeated her words, you volunteered to join the army in order to save your dear friend. Mama shook her head, but she said, okay. I'm going to take you to the end of Myra's story. So Myra's family ends up right here in Minnesota. I went to McAllister College. I knew exactly what I wanted to study, international studies and economics. I wanted to help rebuild what the wars had broken. Richard Holbrook was our freshman convocation speaker. He was the man who had drafted the peace agreement that ended the Bosnian War. As he was talking, I felt the goosebumps rise on my arms, not because of the content of his words, but for the fact that life had brought me to this moment in time. In my junior year of college, for a moment, I questioned what I wanted to do and who I would become. Then I discovered that I had been placed in Kirk Hall, in Kofi Annan's old room. Kofi Annan was then the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. I reckoned with myself. There was always only one thing I would ever become, this child refugee, a person who knew and understood what it was like to grow up in a war. I had to become brave, and I had to use whatever means I could find to save the pieces of myself that were in danger of dying in that lonely apartment where I waited for peace. That is from Myra's story. I'm going to now skip ahead and read to you from Evgeny's story in a piece titled Certificate of Humanity. Evgeny is from Afghanistan. At the age of 19, a brilliant student, he graduated from university. USAID went to him and asked him to work for them. He agreed. And then one day the Taliban called. And I'll just pick up in the middle of the story. I went first to my supervisor at USAID, an American woman for whom I had a lot of respect. She listened to my story with her head down, her hands in front of her, clasped on her desk. It was a familiar story to her. She worked with enough Afghans, who had been threatened by the Taliban and knew of the disappearances and the deaths. She told me about the special immigrant visa that SIV offered through the State Department and told me to apply. She said that as a bookkeeper for USAID, I would qualify. However, the government only issued up to 50 such visas each year for both Iraqis and Afghans who had worked with the US Armed Forces or under the Chief of Mission Authority. She spoke with some reservation because there was a 3-year wait period for security screening and clearance. Neither of us spoke the question in the room. Could I wait for 3 years? At home, my mother and father and I decided that the only way I could survive was if I hid in the house and stopped going out. I sent a message to my workplace to tell them I would not be coming in anymore. I sat deep in the bowels of our house, surrounded by the mud walls of my ancestors, knowing that if the Taliban wanted to find me, they could simply march through our front door and unleash their bullets. If they wanted, they could drop a bomb on all of us. I couldn't sleep or eat despite the people I loved gathered around me, despite my mother and father assuring me of their love. They told me that hiding in our house was not an act of cowardice, but the actions of a reasonable human being. I felt young under their protection, and yet I was too old and had seen too much to believe that their love could protect me. Every minute that I was home that month, I felt keenly that everyone I loved was in danger because of my living presence. I made the decision to leave Afghanistan. I made arrangements with a human trafficker and was able to pay the price he demanded for taking me out of the country, $25,000 US. I tried to find a reputable trafficker who brought a contract for us to sign. The first line of the contract was a waiver. The trafficker was not responsible for my life or my death. They had no responsibility to return my body, alive or dead. Everything that happened to me on the road to probable survival depended on my following all of their instructions. Even then, they could not guarantee that I would make it out of Afghanistan. Other clauses in the contract said things like they would divulge information only when it was necessary, and the less I knew, the safer I would be. I signed the contract with a black pen. My mother and my father hovered behind me. The trafficker averted his eyes sympathetically. So Afghani signs this contract, he leaves, and his father is missing. His father has never been found. But Afghani ends up at a refugee camp in Sweden, a 5-star resort that has been turned into a refugee camp. And that is where I will end from the reading. The title of the Peace Certificate of Humanity comes from here. So in this camp, Afghani he's always asking for a certificate of humanity. They decide that he's crazy, so they take him to see the camp psychiatrist, and this is that conversation. The camp psychiatrist got to know me well. At first, she was unsure about my mental health. She was baffled by my request for a certificate of my humanity. She asked me if I believed I was human. I said, of course, but other people weren't so sure. So I needed help proving my humanity. She then offered to provide me with such proof. But why? I asked her. What is the difference between you and me? How come you are more human than me, in a position to observe and certify my humanity? After all, do we not have the same blood, the same makeup, the same dreams even? Why are you more successful in your humanity than I am in mine? I told her that if she was going to give me a certificate of humanity, she would have to show me hers first. I had to know who had given her the authority to determine human certification. Afghani now lives in these cities. He's an office manager by day and a Lyft driver by night. Only 30 years old, his hair is solid white. I will end my reading today with a reading from Mr. Michael's story. Mr. Michael is from Eritrea. Mr. Michael's daughters went to college with me many years ago. But his piece is called Officially Unconfirmed because, as those of you who work in refugee resettlement know, so much of what happens in the lives of refugees are never confirmed in the official paperwork. And so this is from the refugee camp in Sudan. where Mr. Michael has left his grandmom, who raised him as his mother, behind, so that his daughters might have a chance. In 1985 and 86, there was a big cholera outbreak in the refugee camps across Sudan. While the outbreaks remain officially unconfirmed, just like the continuous killing of civilians in Asmara, I was there and I lived through it. In the refugee camp at the height of the crisis, there were 25,000 people sick with cholera. The disease did not discriminate among the poor and the war-stricken population. On the hospital beds, men and women and children lay head to foot, side by side, writhing in agony, or so quiet and still and depleted they appeared dead. The people were like tubes. What we put in one end flowed out the other. In the camp hospital, doctors and nurses and all the medical personnel were called to attention. We ran down the aisles doing our best to respond to the cries and the pleas of the sick and those who loved them. The stench of vomit and diarrhea, of human sweat and fear filled the rooms, and the flies flew in swarms of black. The sick people sat, if they could, hands holding their tummies and their heads. Those who could not sit slept on the bed, skin and bones disappearing beneath the clothes they wore. Their eyes were closed, their eyes were open, holes in the skeletal faces. They stared without seeing. Sounds of human suffering abounded day and night with the endless buzzing of the flies. In those 2 years, all of time became the suffocating moment, the frenzy, the crazy, impossible task of helping the sick ones make it through the painful process, one way or the other. Near the end of the epidemic, the refugee camp hospital had no more gloves. We lower-level workers handed the doctors in charge the gloves that we could find. None of them took the gloves from our proffered hands. They shook their heads, too busy for words, and gestured for us to put on the gloves. Sweat dribbled down their faces, dark faces glistening in the heat of battle. Once pale faces now flushed red. The United Nations doctors saved the gloves for the nurses and the ambulance drivers like me. They worked without gloves around the clock, through the night and the day to save the people. Only 700 people died because of them. I promised myself then that if I had money one day, I would give it to the United Nations doctors. What they did in that Sudanese refugee camp saved a part of me that was in danger of dying. I had seen how people could take lives in Asmara, in the despair of the camp in Sudan. I saw how people could give life, and somehow in this knowledge, my dreams for humanity were saved. In 1991, 2 years before Eritrea won its independence, but just as the war was ending, I became an American citizen. The Star Tribune came to the ceremony. They published a picture of all of us new Americans, of all the hands that were raised, mine, an old man's hands, crooked and bent, skin with lines, the color of white fanning out in all directions like a web, was the highest. It was God that I was speaking to, thanking him for loving me, my family, and my people, and showing us that peace is possible if we hold fast to not only the bad stories, but the good ones. Life is too short for just the bad to happen, even in a hard life. That is from Michael Tesfaye. Again, this book is a collection of 14 different stories, and I could read any of them. They're all incredibly powerful. For me, they're a reminder, in some ways like Myra's story, that although I'm a child of war, and if my mom and dad could choose the things I could write of, I would be living in some fairy tale kingdom elsewhere. But like Myra, I write of the people who remain even after the leaving is done. Like Myra, I choose to return, perhaps the little girl that I was in Banminai refugee camp waiting for a life somewhere. Michaela knows this, that my family is here because of the International Institute of Minnesota. It's been many years, but the work that began on that day when this little girl entered into this country continues in the woman that I am. It continues in the work that we all do in this room together, holding up different segments so that this community that we belong to can remain whole, even as it breaks open painfully sometimes. I want to thank all of you for giving me this time. And I look forward to the rest of our time together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I just have a lot of questions, but in the essence of time, I'll ask you too. Is that okay? Kalia? Okay. What I really appreciated about your book is just how it humanizes the refugee experience, which in my observation sometimes gets lost because there's facts and figures and that pulls rank. And for those of us who work in the funding community, we're often tasked with advocacy. And what I'd like to know is, when you were meeting with your interviewees, what did they impress upon you as one of the biggest things they wish was understood or really elevated more broadly as people look to work in this space?
That is such a thoughtful question. You know, Hara al-Nabi, who's from Iraq, she tells me that she wants the world to judge her. She's not scared of their judgment. She wants them to judge her after learning about her story. I'm a writer. I believe that in the power of the human story, that it must be able to change forever for the better of the human life. But for so many refugees, those stories have been taken away by fear, by language, by other elements of life as we know it here in America. Part of the gift for me in writing this book, and part of the reasons why these individuals agreed to meet me, was because they knew that I would give them, in some sense, their stories back, not only to themselves and their families, but to our community. We live in a world here in Minnesota teeming with refugees, but we don't get the opportunity to enter into each other's homes, to talk and to hear from each other's hearts. That is the gift of art. That is what art allows. You know, I knew at the onset that I was going to offer a reflection for each, but what I would offer was a portraiture. I visited the great museums. I know how the portrait lives on long after the mirrors have broken down. You know, in terms of the conversation about funding and what is important here, then we all have the same dreams. We all have the same goals. There is in that a tremendous truth. Minnesota is incredibly young by the standards of a big world. You know, we who live here know that we are living on stolen land, that long before we came with our accents, no matter how many generations ago, this land belonged first to the Native Americans. Part of what I hear again and again as I'm talking to each of these individuals is this understanding that we are living on lands of folks murdered from the past, in the present, in the future. How do we take responsibility for these crimes, and how do we take responsibility for each other? That was, you know, impressed upon me from 1,000 different angles. It is about taking responsibility for each other as brothers and sisters, as keepers of each other's humanity, because we all need reminders somewhere on this journey that who we are and what we do matters profoundly in the book of humanity. My grandma used to say, nobody gets to write their own book. If we're any good at all, we get one line in the book of humanity. I understood this, and each and every single individual who spoke with me for Somewhere in the Unknown World understood this much, including some individuals right here in this room, that we don't get to write the book of humanity. If we're good, we get one line. And that was so important to me.
I love that. Thank you so much for those words. They really ring true in light of so much that's happening in our community right now. This notion that our humanity is tied together. That speaks to the heart. Thank you again so much. I'm going to move us forward. And again, thank you for your readings. At this time, I would like to introduce Michaela Schumann from the International Institute of Minnesota. We're going to have her present about the refugee resettlement process to provide some context and hopefully give you a better sense of the ecosystem and the consortium before we move into our Q&A. So I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Cassie, and thank you to Kalia. it's not easy to follow you. So I just love hearing your stories, the stories that you wrote about in your book. And I feel like it's such a great addition to the information I'm going to present, because you really do let the people speak for themselves and tell their own stories. And that's a really important element as we talk about numbers and data, to remember these are real people with real families and real dreams for the future. So thank you so much for that, and for sharing that with our community. So hi everyone, my name is Michaela Schuneman. I am the Director of Refugee Services at International Institute of Minnesota. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the program, and then we have a panel of representatives from all of the resettlement agencies in Minnesota who will answer questions. So I'm going to go pretty fast through this. I apologize. I'm not going to take any questions while I go through, so please do hold on to your questions for the end of the presentation, and we'll all be very happy to answer them. These are the agencies in Minnesota that provide refugee resettlement services. They are Arrive Ministries, Catholic Charities of Southern Minnesota, International Institute of Minnesota, Lutheran Social Service, and Minnesota Council of Churches. And 4 of us are located in the metro, and Catholic Charities of Southern Minnesota is in Rochester. All right, next slide, please. So over the course of the modern resettlement program in the United States, we have welcomed over 3 million refugees through the program. And up until 2017, the US actually resettled more refugees each year than every other country combined. So we were always leaders in the resettlement program and really set an example for other countries as to why it is such an important program. First, I'd just like to provide a little context for what, who we're speaking about and how they qualified for the resettlement program. So in order to be resettled through the refugee resettlement program into any country, you have to meet this legal definition of a refugee. And the UNHCR High Commissioner for Refugees is the agency that usually determines whether someone has met this definition and is qualified for resettlement. And so in order to give that status, the refugee status, to someone, they can either base it on an entire category of people, an entire group, or make an individual determination. And in order to be a refugee under the law, you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution on behalf of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And then you're unable to return to your country of origin because of that fear of persecution. So it's a pretty narrow definition. And as you can see, there are currently 79 million people who are forcibly displaced from their country of origin. But of them, only 26 million actually qualify as refugees. So only 26 million people meet that sort of narrow definition, even though there are quite a few more people who are displaced, but they don't meet that persecution level, or maybe the persecution is not on behalf of one of those categories. And then you can see from that chart, the number has gone up in recent years. Yeah, we don't have to get into it too much, but yeah, it's an increasing number, unfortunately, due to conflicts that are happening in many places right now. So we like to include this slide actually to do what Kalia's book did, which is really talk about what are people doing when they get here. People are contributing in many ways to the fabric of our community, including by contributing in civic life, by becoming US citizens and voters, by becoming homeowners, and then of course contributing financially to the community, and by entering the workforce and starting businesses and actually hiring other employees, so creating jobs. You can go on to the next slide. So this slide provides a little more information about the United States Refugee Resettlement Program. And our current modern program started actually in 1980 under the Refugee Act. US had been resettling refugees before then, but that's really when the current program was created. And under that law, the President of the United States sets a refugee ceiling each year at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is on October 1st. So the President determines the maximum number of refugees that will be resettled in that fiscal year. Once that ceiling has been determined, then Congress appropriates the funding to allow for the program to proceed for the year. And the US Department of State is the agency that handles the resettlement. So the US Department of State actually has contracts with 9 national nonprofits, national resettlement agencies, and each of those 9 agencies works with smaller agencies around the United States. So all of the local resettlement agencies has a national office, and our national office is actually the one that contracts with the State Department. And those national offices work with the State Department to determine where people will go around the country. So they look at each community and each agency's capacity to resettle refugees. You can see from the chart, oh, sorry, still on that one, sorry. You can see from the chart, there's an orange line that shows the refugee ceiling each year, and then the blue bars show how many people were actually admitted. So in recent years, both of those have gone down dramatically, as you can see, to an historic low last year of only 11,814 refugees being admitted. And then this year will be another historic low because we're going to be far below that, unfortunately. Okay, now we're ready. Thanks. Minnesota, as Kalia mentioned, has a really proud tradition of welcoming refugees and has actually welcomed quite a few refugees over the years, and it has a significant population of immigrants who came to the US as refugees. So that makes Minnesota kind of unique among states. And unfortunately, as the national numbers decreased, you can see our local numbers have also decreased in terms of the number of people admitted through the program. In fiscal year 20, which is the year that ended on September 30th of 2021, the population that we resettled, the largest population that we resettled were actually Karen refugees from Burma, followed by former Soviet Union, Afghan, Somali refugees as well. So the population that we worked with also changed pretty significantly during the Trump administration in terms of who was allowed entry through the program. And I'm sure many of you heard of the Muslim ban, which impacted refugee resettlement as well. So we went through a kind of a tough period over the last few years. And a couple of years ago, International Institute actually celebrated our centennial. And as part of that, we had a presentation and a booklet made about the work that we've done over those 100 years. And this chart really stands out to us because it shows that of the people in Minnesota who were born outside the US in 1920, and the number of people born outside of the US currently living in Minnesota in 2020, and they're pretty much the same level, which is pretty amazing. Obviously, there's been, some changes over the years, but one of the things that really stands out in this chart is the countries that people came from that's what really has changed over time. So you can see 100 years ago, most of the people that were coming to the US were from Europe, and now that has changed and is a little more diverse. You can see, from that chart. So we like to show that because it shows that immigration trends have changed, but the actual population of US born and Minnesota born is not that different. So when someone comes to the United States with refugee status, they are coming here as one of a group of immigrants, one category of immigrants. So each year the US welcomes immigrants that have many different legal categories, and refugee is one of them. So the status is actually granted prior to someone's arrival in the US, but once they get here, they are eligible to work. They are on track to get a green card 1 year after arrival and are eligible for citizenship 5 years after arrival. And refugees are very unique among immigrants because refugees are eligible for public benefits, which makes them very different. Most immigrants are not eligible to apply for public benefits, but refugees are because of their status, having the humanitarian status that they do when they enter the US. So the resettlement period. So this is the amount of time that we have as agencies to work with someone. Once they enter the US, the program through the State Department lasts up to 90 days after arrival. And after that, we are expected that, it is expected that our clients will be self-sufficient. So during those initial 90 days, we have a lot of work to do. And all of the agencies that provide resettlement services are required to provide the same core resettlement tasks, but the way we do it is a little different. Each agency has their own kind of mixture of employees, professionals, and volunteers working with our clients to accomplish all of these tasks that we have to get done in 90 days. The first of which happens before clients even arrive, and that is that we are required to find and furnish housing. We greet people at the airport. We connect them to services such as Social Security, cash, food, and medical benefits, a health screening, English classes, school registration, and employment services. So there is a lot happening in those first 90 days. We are also required to provide cultural orientation, which means we are teaching people how the systems in the US work. So the legal, healthcare, immigration, and education systems. We are also teaching people about their landlord-tenant relationships, because even though we find the housing, our clients are the ones who sign leases. So they are the ones actually developing that relationship. So we have to teach them how that works. We're teaching people the transportation system, so how to get around, how to get to work. And we do that through a combination of federal funding and then other funding that we can apply for. So the federal funding that we receive is $2,275 per arrival. So if we don't have an arrival, we don't receive the $2,275. That is only given to us after someone gets here. Of that amount, $1,050 is allowed to go towards the agency's expenses, and then $1,225 is designated to be spent on behalf of the client. So renting housing, furnishing housing, buying food, the initial groceries, bus cards, or other things that people need when they arrive. One of the things that is great about doing refugee resettlement in Minnesota is that we have really strong collaborative relationship among the refugee resettlement agencies. And I have heard that is not the case everywhere, that some places are competitive or they don't get along with each other. That is not the case in Minnesota. We actually work together on a lot of things. We are very collaborative. If any of us has a question about something, we can pick up the phone and call another person. Pre-pandemic, we used to meet for breakfast now and then in the metro and have kind of informal meetings. So these are some of the ways we collaborate formally. We collaborate on housing issues, advocacy and awareness. So we give joint presentations. We consult with local government officials to talk about the resettlement program, and we host the Refugee Consortium in the Twin Cities, which is a network of providers and other stakeholders. So government officials, people from the education system, community organizations, where we get together and talk about resettlement and trends and how things are going. And then we also work together on programs and grants. So what is happening now? What's going to happen in the future? These are the questions that we get a lot, especially after the election, because we had a new president. And so we're still operating under the refugee ceiling that was put in place by President Trump before he left office. The ceiling is 15,000, which is very low. President Biden has said that he will raise the ceiling for the current year, but it hasn't happened yet. And President Biden has also indicated that he will support a refugee ceiling of 125,000 people annually. So that's a pretty significant jump, obviously, from 15,000 to 125,000 people per year. Just to give a little context, in President Obama's last year in office, the refugee ceiling was 85,000. So this would be going even above that number. So we anticipate that for the year starting October 1st, the refugee ceiling will be raised to 125,000. But over the past several years, we have seen a pretty damaging changes to the refugee resettlement program, not only among nonprofit agencies like ours, but actually from within the State Department. A lot of changes were made that will make it very difficult for us to see the increase in arrivals. It will happen, but it's going to take a lot of time. We don't actually expect 125,000 refugees to arrive next year because of all of those changes that were made over the past 4 years. One of the things now that we are discussing among our individual agencies and with each other, and then within the broader community, is what do we need to do locally to rebuild our capacity? How do we get back to where we were in 2016 and when we were welcoming 85,000 arrivals per year? We need to, in a way, we're lucky we have a little time to really plan ahead and kind of think about what we need to do as a community to be ready for resettlement and for arrivals to come back. So we're currently identifying gaps in services and resources. We are reestablishing our connections with landlords because housing is one of the most pressing concerns that we have. And then we're re-engaging with our supporters and volunteers and doing presentations, talking to the broader community about all the contributions that refugees make to the community. And then the last two slides are materials that we created in collaboration to have kind of joint talking points and joint messaging that we can provide when we are giving presentations. So I know you've received this presentation ahead of time, but it kind of summarizes a lot of the things that we've talked about today about why having a strong refugee resettlement program makes Minnesota a stronger community. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop because I'm sure people have lots of questions, and I will open it back up to Cassie and then the panel of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela, for walking us through that. Yes, at this time, we want to transition to Q&A, but I'd like to just first introduce our panelists who are with us today and send again a big thank you to them for taking time to speak. So on our call today, we have Yusuf Abdi, who is the Program Director of Lutheran Social Services of Minnesota. Hi, Yusuf, thanks for joining us. We also have Krista Algor, who is the Direct Program Service Director at Arrive Ministries. We have John Mayers, who is the Case Manager at Catholic Charities of Southern Minnesota. Hi, John. And you all just met Michaela Schunen, who's the Refugee Services Director, at the International Institute of Minnesota. And finally, we have Ben Whalen, who is the Division Director of Refugee Services with the Minnesota Council of Churches. So again, a big thank you, heartfelt thank you to all of you for joining us today. We want this to be organic and to do popcorn style. So if you have questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat if you would prefer, or just kind of raise your hand and unmute. Otherwise, we do have some questions that we can ask the panel as well. So I will, at this time, just pause and see if there are any questions from anybody on the call.
I just have a quick clarifying question. Hi, everyone. My name is Kabau, and I'm with Otto Bremer Trust. But just around the numbers that are being counted around refugees, how are the numbers counted for those who are sponsored by like other family members who are already here in the US? Are they counted as like a refugee legally in the terminology that you talked about early on, Michaela?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute there. Yeah, that's a great question. So it is a little bit of a technical question because the answer depends on the way that the family member applies for their relatives to join them. So if someone applies through the immigrant visa process, so they are applying as someone who is a permanent resident or US citizen and then applies for their family member, then that person comes to the United States on an immigrant visa, and they do not count towards the refugee resettlement numbers at all. Regardless of the initial immigration status of the petitioner, it just doesn't matter if they are coming as someone with green card status or immigrant visa status. However, if the person is applying for a relative to join them while they are still a refugee, then that's a different process. And if that's the case, then when that person comes to the United States, they are also coming with refugee status. And anyone who enters the US with refugee status counts toward that refugee ceiling. And they are eligible for all of the resettlement benefits. I hope that makes sense. And anyone else on board, if you want to add, go ahead.
Great. Any other questions from anyone at this time? Well, I have a few questions. Oh.
I have a question. Yes. My name is Minna Brooks from the Marburg Foundation. My question is about rebuilding capacity that you talked about. I'd love to learn just a little bit more about that in terms of what is involved and where the funding comes from.
This is Ben Wall, and I'm at the Minnesota Council of Churches. So I'll take a step at that. I think what the capacity, in terms of rebuilding capacity, we've, as Michaela had shown, we've gone from, as a country, resettling 85,000 people down to, this year through 7 months, less than 3,000 people. So we have gone to, as a program that is, funded based on the numbers of people coming through and being resettled, we've gone to just a fraction of the budget for this work nationally that used to be provided by the State Department. So it's going to be a daunting task to kind of go back to previous era numbers, which on one hand we're excited for. This is important work, and we're excited to see families reunify and be part of showing worldwide leadership by having this program. But it's also a situation where half of the resettlement agencies around the country have closed up their programs these last 4 years, where there's been atrophy within the State Department and with overseas processing to even get people registered for the program and for the possibility. Here locally, when we have moved from 2,500 people being resettled in the state in a given year down to less than 400 in a year, and this year I think we're at something like 40 people statewide thus far. We have to rebuild connections with landlords, with school districts, with the various resources that our clients will need when they first arrive. And so that will be our focus here locally, to be rebuilding those personal connections, building new connections with resources that are going to be available, but also internally building out our staff and programming to make sure that we have holistic and ongoing services available for people when they arrive. So there's We also need to we'll need to kind of revitalize our volunteer base. All of our programs just solicit and distribute a lot of in-kind gifts, whether that's furniture, whether it's other types of donations that we bring into this work. So all of those systems, I think, are things that we will be building on. So as for funding for that, some of that will be, the increase as arrivals increase, and we would expect that funding will increase from the government. But as we build into that, certainly we're all going to be looking to our private contributors and supporters to be helping us grow the kind of the service we can do.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to ask a question that speaks to what I think is kind of a pressing topic in philanthropy around equity and equity advancement. So Minnesota's kind of this dichotomy, right, where we have an amazing reputation of welcoming refugees, which is something to be very proud of. And then we also know, especially within the last year, that we don't have the best reputation for BIPOC communities here, and it's a very real dichotomy is the only word that really comes to my mind. And so I'm wondering, as Minnesota has been a leader in opening our arms, but not so much for BIPOC folks, how do you prepare and educate refugees to face this reality and build bridges between the refugee communities and BIPOC communities as they share this common struggle?
Well, I'll take a first stab at that. And I think just by saying firstly that all of our organizations, just like organizations throughout our state, and are needing to look internally and see how we change who we are and how we operate to make sure that we live and work and have equitability throughout our systems. I think one of the things, what I will say is refugee resettlement agencies services, we have a long history of kind of working in a multicultural space where we have very multicultural, multilingual staff and working in partnership with community-based organizations and people from a variety of backgrounds. We also work very hard to provide holistic services to refugees, to people that we're resettling, so that they have the tools at hand to be successful here. But as you said, Cassie, I think we also recognize that despite Minnesota being a place of, in quote unquote, welcome to refugees, certainly a larger percentage of our population here came as refugees than almost any other place in the US. We also know that there are those significant gaps in society for people of color, for Native Americans, and for the people we serve within our community. And so, firstly, we too need to be, as agencies, need to be focusing on how we are promoting equity, how we are advancing equity in our state. So that, for example, at MCC, that involves changing our governance, and it involves having a board of directors who, for the first time in May, will be a majority BIPOC. And we have to do that so that our governments, our leadership, so that our the choices we make and the way that we serve people are based in equity and are based in equity for everybody. We also have to continue to build those partnerships as organizations with other organizations. Again, as a Christian-based organization, as MCC is, as are a number of us that are in this space, we have to make sure that that we are well connected and working in partnership, working in collaboration with other faith communities and other community members and people that are part of the groups that we are serving. On an individualized basis, certainly we offer things like cultural orientation to the newcoming arrivals. We provide holistic case management, and we need to be looking at ways that we broaden those conversations and we deepen that trust with individuals so that we can be talking about the real and ongoing concerns and the real impacts of inequities in our society. I would, just as an example, kind of logistically where we struggle sometimes and where our agency has struggled, is that we know that, or one of the parameters of our contract with the State Department is that we are readily engaging with law enforcement, with the police, in consulting with the police as we are welcoming arrivals to our state. That's at this moment, that's become a very fraught, consultation, or a very fraught relationship, one that doesn't seem to be as relevant in terms of trying to build connection as it is in countering an unjust system at this time. And so we are also in the midst of trying to figure out how do we operate in a space where we have institutional imperatives, but need to retain that human connection with people in a way that will provide them with the best opportunity to succeed.
Thank you for that. I understand we had a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Yusuf.
I was just going to quickly add some comments that Ben had made. Cassie, that's a great question. And we get to see a lot of our new arrivals are coming to the state of Minnesota. As we all say, Minnesota is a very, very welcoming state for many of our families that are coming in over the years. However, we sometimes do see some challenges that arise, especially how our state regionalized. So if you go an hour from here, where we have Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota, resettles refugees in St. Cloud, central Minnesota. And it's the experience and the challenges that we face is quite different than what we see in the metro. So, and as I'm sure a lot of you have read the headlines, worst place for Somali refugees to be in St. Cloud. And we have the largest groups of Somalis that are moving to St. Cloud for employment, for families, for whatnot. And it's just the experience that we get to hear and the things that are happening. Overall, the longtime residents of those, like in St. Cloud or those neighborhoods, are wonderful. They're great people. But you got a pockets of people that are outside of that community that are targeting, specifically refugees that are coming from Muslim majority countries or who look like different. And I've had the experience where we get to listen to those folks, and whatever we do, whatever educational awareness or data or whatever information you provide, their agenda, and it's clear, very visible, hatred, where they do not want to see someone who is, who doesn't share the same similarities in culture and whatnot. So for us, even though our refugees are coming into this state, have no clue what they're walking in and what they're going to experience, it's something that we have to do from get-go upon arrival. And our conversations, and nowadays I think a lot of our refugee families are well connected. Well, with globalization, things are a little bit easier for them to understand what's happening. But most of them are busy because they have to work and they have to pay the bills. And the experience, just going to Walmart to buy groceries is totally different when some refugee families in St. Cloud compared to the metro. So it's really interesting times. There are a lot of refugee families are coming into I would say our state. But overall, there is a lot of work that needs to be done for specifically certain groups of people that are coming into the state.
Thank you.
I had a question, Cassie, just about funding. I was curious, so I saw that, and I wasn't clear if it was each person or each family gets that 2,000 or so from the feds and how that's split up. And then curious what the percentage of public dollars is versus philanthropic. And then are there specific roles you're looking for private philanthropy to play that the federal dollars or the public dollars don't cover?
Yeah, I can just, to answer the question about the federal funding, that is per person. So if we had a family of 5, that would be multiplied by 5. And so I would say each of our agencies, and one of the things I didn't really get to talk about in the presentation, but each of our agencies then has we have other programming to supplement the resettlement program. None of us here has, only a resettlement program, because we all know 90 days is not a lot of time. There are people who are totally self-sufficient after 90 days, and I'm like always amazed by that, but most people they're going to need additional support beyond that 90 days, sometimes even just to wait for their social security card so it doesn't get lost in the mail. Like, we're still working with people far beyond the 90 days. And that is, I think, where we start to see these gaps, right? Because we get funding from the federal government and they're saying, okay, well, after 90 days, you're done, move on. And what we know is we need a lot of support beyond that. And even within that 90 days, there are other things going on in people's lives that require support, not just a checklist of things that we're going through, but we need to have funding to help people connect with medical services, beyond the regular refugee health screening. Sometimes people have additional needs. We all collaborate in the Metro on an employment grant. So we work together to help people get jobs. International Institute also has career paths. We have 2 pathways to help people go beyond that initial job, but then work their way up to become nurses or to pursue a hospitality certification through community college. So we have a lot of different programs that we all provide through our agencies. And the ways that we fund them is very different. So some of us will have state grants, some of us have private foundation grants. That I think all of the organizations other than International Institute are supported by churches. And so there's support that comes through religious communities as well. So we're all kind of finding other ways to supplement our federal funding, which is really, insufficient. And they acknowledge that it's insufficient. That's one of their reasons when, they work with us, is saying, hey, you're a nonprofit, you need to go out and fundraise to match what we're going to be giving you.
Is there so they recognize that 90 days is crazy.
That they don't necessarily recognize that.
I'm just wondering about advocacy, lobbying, how do we make that more realistic?
Yeah, I mean, I know for a while when Keith Ellison was in Congress, actually, he had introduced a bill to extend the resettlement period to 6 months. I forget the name of that bill, but it didn't get very far, but so there has been some conversation around that, but I would say that's probably not likely to happen in the near future. I don't know what others, I see Yusuf, you're unmuted. What do you think?
Actually, Sharon, I was going to share a quick math. We have looked at this 90-day funding model that we get, a little over 1,000. It's about $10 per day. The overhead, the work that needs to be, all the tasks that we need to achieve within 90 days, it's about $10 a day. So the federal government knows, this is a public-private partnership model, and all of us here agree that the majority of our time we're spending on just trying to figure out how can we make ends meet and fundraising and all that. I hope, our neighbors in Canada, they have at least a year of resettlement where there's case management and all the great services that we can provide to families. 90 days is just not realistic to do all the work that we need to do. And for me, I would say we need more time and we need more resources. And as far as the time, it will be very beneficial for our families just to be able, the initial services that we provide, they're just coming in, they completely just don't have, good understanding of what's happening in that first 90 days. But I think beyond that, that's where we can spend time to hopefully provide some community integration and long-term planning of case management, which will be really successful partnerships that we can build on. But with 90 days, we're just trying to capture all the basic things we can with the limited resources that we have. And all of us, I think one of our dream lists is that if we were given more time, I usually say 12 months, it would be ideal. If we were given more time and more resources, we could do a lot. And that will give a huge kickstart for our families to do really well for their well-being and their future investment in this country.
Thank you.
I will just say one of the other things that we are struggling with is, as mentioned earlier, is about housing. And so One of the things that Michaela mentioned is that we have to secure the housing ahead of time before they arrive. And I don't know when the last time you tried to rent an apartment, but without having the person physically there and you go and try and rent it from them. And so even having funds for transitional housing, something that would allow us to have a place that they could go for the first few nights for us to set up apartments. There's a lot of housing issues, and just trying to think outside the box of how we could address those. And some of it would be with some extra funding to look at ways to address the problem. And especially if we're going to increase our numbers, the Metro I know has it, but in southern Minnesota, we're really facing a housing crisis. And so we do need some new ideas to how to address housing for resettlement.
That was a great question. And I was just reading the chat. Thank you, Cal Kalia, for sharing, this message of having to say, we are resettling you into poverty. That's just heartbreaking. I know we only have a little bit more time together. If there aren't any questions, I'd like to pose maybe 1 or 2 questions to the panel. I'll pause to see if there are any questions right now before I dive in.
Hi, I had a question. I'm Denise Mayette from the Sheltering Arms Foundation. And I first was wondering if the agencies were involved in the most recent census, in terms of understanding what the numbers of refugee families in the state were. And then also, it seems like, since the results have come out about the census, there has been a lot of attention paid to the fact that the reduction in immigration numbers is really having a detrimental effect on the country, and that it is an argument about both raising the numbers of refugees and immigrants that are allowed in, but also just maybe, in terms of, I was thinking about the infographic you did about the value to the state. It's absolutely clear that our state and our country, are not really growing without additional immigrants that are coming in, and just wondering if there's been conversation about using the results of the census as a way of putting pressure on raising those caps.
I think I can answer the first part of what you talked about in terms of were we involved in helping our clients, helping newly arrived refugees fill out the census? Yes, I think I can answer for all of us. We were all kind of actively assisting our clients to fill out the census, to make sure they understood what it was and what it meant for them. And I know within our consortium, we worked a lot to make sure that as many people as we could were filling out the census, because they are all eligible to fill it out. But in terms of how we could use that data, maybe someone else has more insight into that, because I don't.
I would just say, I think, Denise, you pointed out immigrants, refugees on a pure economic standpoint make a huge impact in our communities and and that's been proven out in study after study. And it's tough to talk about that because it boils people down to like parts of the economic engine, and I don't want to do that. But but as we will, the state demographer has noted it. It's been academically studied that as a community, we will atrophy and our economy will suffer if we don't have an influx of people coming here from other states, other countries. And refugees have been a huge source of our population growth in this state at a time when our seniors move south to warmer climes, and as a time where the birth rate in the US has gone down. Refugees and immigrants have sustained our economy. And so there will be, the results of this, the 89 people that keep us with an 8th representative here in the state, will be, obviously that will be studied, and there will be conversation about that. I think that's as we start to understand kind of what that impact has been.
And I can also just speak to rural Minnesota, where we do settling down in Austin and Albert Lea, and just what the economic impact of revitalizing those cities has been. If you look at Austin, for example, or even Albert Lea was a city that looked like it was dying, but due to the influx of refugees and immigrants, it's a city that's being revitalized. And I think the communities are seeing that. I know in Austin especially, there's been a huge understanding of how refugees and immigrants have helped the city, and houses that were sitting empty now are being bought and fixed up, and actually a community is thriving again, and grocery stores are opening up again. So I think that's being seen, and I think the census is a great talking point about that, like you said. But for some of these communities, I think they're seeing it already, that what that impact has had on their communities.
Great questions. So I'm going to ask the crystal ball question, right? Which is, what is on the horizon? You know, do you think that the Biden administration will deliver on its promises? And if so, what does that mean for your work? I know we've spoken on that a little bit, but I would love to hear as we wrap up what you think that will really mean from your work. Maybe if each panelist would like to go around and just speak to that. And I would second a second part to that is, you know, if, you know, what can be a call of action to those of us who work in the funding community in terms of ways that we can look to support your work.
So I knew about the first part of this question, so I was prepared a little bit, but I did tell everyone ahead of time that's one of those questions that we get asked, and then we go check the news feed an hour later and find out things have changed. So I'm going to put out what I know so far. Last week when we were talking about this, Biden was just in the process of signing the presidential determination, which changed the population allocation of where populations were coming from. And there was a tremendous pushback that why didn't he raise the ceiling at that time? I think what we're going to see in the next few weeks is that he will sign something that will raise the ceiling to 65,000. However, as we mentioned already, this is really an aspirational number. There's no way we as a country can get to that. And it's purely because of what's going on overseas, that the processing that was supposed to take place a year and a half ago with USCIS officers didn't happen, that the capacity to just process and then the medical screening. So the number I think will be put out there, but I do not think we'll reach it this year at any close. I think this will be probably the lowest year if we look at resettlement. Going forward, yeah, I know he will sign 125,000 is what he's talking about. I don't know if we'll get to that number. Just to put it in a little bit of context, the last time we were at 120,000 was in 1990. So it's over 30 years ago that we were even at that number in our ceiling. So what that means though, if we get even, half of that would be a huge increase to our work. And so as we've talked about already, it does require us to think differently, because this would be a year over year increase than what we've kind of been seeing in these last few years. So it requires us to look at resettling. How do we engage the community more in this process? I think that has been the lesson I've learned in these last few years, is that resettlement really does require the community's buy-in. That if this community does not understand what we're doing, it's not there to welcome us, they're not going to be the ones to advocate for the housing and against, the pushbacks and the numbers. So I think community engagement is something that is, as we go forward, is something that we're really going to be focusing a lot of effort on, and kind of what as we push forward. So that and housing are the two things that I keep talking to people about. So I'll stop and let other people jump in, but that would be what I would say.
I think in terms of the new presidential administration and the federal policies around immigration and refugees are certain to be more humane than what we've come out of. That will be the case. How far they will be willing to go to make those policies more humane, that's yet to be seen. And I think they've been slower to start than we'd hoped. What I do know that is, regardless of what numbers President Biden will choose to admit, we are also at a point where refugee resettlement still remains a polarized political venture. And we can see that in public polling and in attitudes that we know exist in our communities. Things that were certainly heightened during the last administration, but will continue to persist now. So that is something where this work previously was either not understood or under the radar for many years. but now in a heightened political system, the community engagement, the education of people, of community members, the continuing work to build a welcoming and inclusive community on all fronts is going to be extremely important. And so that needs to be a huge focus of our work and our community's work.
Yeah, then I second everything John and Ben have said, and I'm going to just mention something that I had actually thought might come up, but didn't come up, but the fact that we are also seeing record numbers of asylum seekers in the United States and people who are, trying to apply for asylum. And in order to receive asylum, they have to meet that same definition of a refugee. So they have to show the well-founded fear of persecution on behalf of one of the grounds. But that is a community that once they receive asylum, have a lot of the same needs as refugees. They're here, they have been persecuted, they have a history of trauma and persecution, and now they're here in the United States, but they're not eligible for the quote unquote resettlement because they're here already, right? So they're not being resettled, but they have the same financial needs, they have a lot of the same other needs, medical needs and such that our refugee clients do. So that is something that is definitely, in my mind, falls into that funding gap area of services for asylees or asylum seekers. They're eligible for public benefits, so we can help them apply for their food assistance, medical assistance, but the housing needs are the same, and all of the mental health and physical health needs are the same. And so having additional support for that population is also really important.
I would add to what everybody already said. I think for all of us, it's been tough, 4 years in the prior administration. And I believe this is a relief for all of us that we're now able to at least sit back. I know John said every hour the news changes, but I think we're quite a ways out of that world where a lot of things were changing, a lot of uncertainties. But with that, I feel like the number that we need to look at is how many refugees that are in refugee camps across the world. Over 26 million people are displaced and are living in refugee camps. And we're talking about 125,000. It just does not do service to that. It's just the world and what challenges that refugees are facing across the world. So for us, I think the best we can do is just to be able to have the system and infrastructure in place to support families who are coming into our neighbors, who are coming into Minnesota. And I would say a lot of foundations, some of you included in this session here, know what it takes the whole community, it takes the whole village to do this work. And we're very grateful to that. Usually when we submit our proposals, when we reach out to the federal partners, they ask us like, okay, who are your supporters? Who are your, who are you working with in order to do successful resettlement in our state? And usually our foundations and partners in the communities are the ones that we brag about and how strong system we have in Minnesota. So we're very grateful to that. Like we said, we will be here. Refugees will be coming, and we are going to be welcoming them to provide that humane resettlement in our state. But it's going to be at least a relief for all the people that have been waiting, for families that have been waiting last 4, 5, 6 years to reunite with their family members. It's really exciting now. I can answer the call and talk to them and say something will happen. Let's stay hopeful. So this is exciting.
Thank you. We are about 4 minutes before close, and I have one question from the chat. It's from Tyson, who's on the call with us. Thank you. And Tyson's question is, how many refugees does Minnesota anticipate in 2022? So we spoke earlier about that September fall timeline for the new year. And this year pretty much holding low, but what would you all anticipate for 2022?
I I think that's yet to be determined. I think if, for one, we don't, the range of numbers of refugees who might come in 2022 could be anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000. We don't really know that. And that will have influence in Minnesota. I would say in the years prior, in the final years of the Obama administration, when the national ceiling was at around 70,000 people, each of those years, Minnesota saw 2,200 to 2,700 people. And so that may be a range that we could start to get to in the coming years. But we'll still have to learn a lot about the policy direction.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you again for your time, and for those of you who are able to join us. If you have follow-up questions, please reach out. And I'm going to end with the quote that our humanity is bound together. And so I hope that you all are encouraged in your work. And Paul, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you all, and thank you, Cassie. So just a few notes from MCF. First off, we are recording this session, and so we'll have that available for you if you did miss parts of it, or if you'd like to go back and review that again. And we also have the PowerPoint. Michaela, can we also share that with folks? Great, thank you. There's so much good data in there, and I know those last two images people didn't get a good chance to see, so we'll make sure that's available for you. A couple of notes of additional programs that are also focused on issues of equity and justice that are coming up that we have. First off, this week on Thursday, MCF is hosting a session about the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Task Force report. That's this Thursday. And then coming up in May, we have a session from the Minnesota Food Funders Network about Indigenous food sovereignty. And even if you're not part of the Minnesota Food Funders Network, you are welcome to join that session. And then we have also in May a training, really a case study about a foundation that has used the Power Moves tool, which is really about thinking about how foundations can share and build power in communities. So that'll be also coming up in May, so check those out. We'd love to see you at some of those sessions. And again, let's just all give a virtual applause and thank you to all of the presenters today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Cassie, this was great. You really pulled together a great team here.
They're amazing. I'm inspired by all of them.
I have learned so much today. So, yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Kalia.
You all know where to find me if you need me.
Definitely.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.